So take me up to that moment where you guys started the dissection. What did you find when you opened her up?
We started opening her up, and we probably got, and I know you can see it in some of the pictures that I took. I think we got about 18 inches down her neck, or down the body, I should say. And that's when I found my first fatty deposit. It was small, but it was like a little white marshmallow. Wasn't big, and it was just one. I'm like, that's not good. Because it's like, we're like literally 18 inches, 2 feet into the snake. As we continued to go down her body, probably after that first little fatty deposit, started finding more, not even a foot deeper. And more became tons, and tons became an atrocious amount, to the point where, and again, like you can see it in the photos, but you couldn't see her internal organs.
Welcome to episode number 90 of the Animals at Home podcast. My name is Dylan Perrin. Thank you so much for tuning in today. So today I'm speaking with Dan Liebel. Dan is a longtime reptile keeper and a keeper of big snakes for the past 15 plus years. Now, Dan caught my eye about a year ago when he made a Facebook post that sort of went viral, and you may have seen it before. I actually have referenced it on the podcast a couple of times, and that's how we ended up starting to chat. He made a post about a Burmese python that he had, Samantha, that died suddenly. She was 22 years old and about 16 feet and 3 inches long. Now, because the death was so sudden and Dan sort of had a little bit of a suspicion that she may have been slightly overweight, he decided to do a necropsy on her, and he opened her up, and what he found was a snake that was morbidly obese, and not only that, died of a heart attack due to the extra fat that it had stored in its body. Now, Dan's Facebook post was essentially raising a red flag for the snake and reptile community, saying, hey, I was feeding this snake. Yes, I overfed her, but at the time I didn't really realize how much I was overfeeding her. He admits in the story that yes, I did think she was overweight a little bit, but he had no idea how overweight she really was. And this is a story about how efficient and amazing snakes and reptiles are at storing energy and how easy it can be to overfeed. Now, Dan lays out an incredibly honest and vulnerable story in this episode. He even mentions, it took a lot of guts to come out and make the Facebook post originally and even come on the podcast to discuss this, but he made the mistake. He admits that. He wants to talk about that in the open so other people don't make the same mistake. Big snake culture is a problem in the community. People who keep big snakes do tend to feed them quite rapidly, and we can find that, tons of social media influencers do this as well in order to have them grow to a large, substantial, impressive size. And this is actually actively killing our snakes. So Dan is coming at the story not from a finger-wagging point of view where he's saying, hey, you guys need to stop overfeeding them. He's saying, I came from this big snake culture. I came from the culture where we're keeping huge snakes in relatively small enclosures and we're feeding them and packing food down their throats. He admittedly even said he didn't even realize he was power feeding because there was still another level of power feeding that the community was doing that he wasn't quite doing. So he assumed that the way he was feeding was actually totally fine. So that's what's so powerful about this conversation is Dan is coming from that community and saying, hey, we need to make some adjustments here. So in this episode, of course, we discuss that. We discuss his big snake, Samantha, the Burmese python who passed away. And of course, we also delve into a little bit of the big snake keeping culture and where are some areas where we can see some improvement there. Now, two other quick things before we jump in the episode. Just because the nature of this topic, overfeeding can be a scary topic for some people, and I know that especially if you're new to snake keeping, you're going to want some sort of concrete rules you can leave this episode with. That is very difficult to do just because of the variability of the species that we all keep. Age, species, there's so many different questions about how to feed your snake properly. But at the very end of the episode, I spent about 15 minutes on my own going through a few pointers that I think everybody can implement to make sure we're at least attempting to not overfeed our snakes. So that's one thing. If you're thinking, I really want some concrete rules, wait to the end and I do go through that a little bit. And Dan also has the Facebook post, like I said. In the Facebook post, he shows pictures of that post-mortem. He shows the pictures of the necropsy. I was considering adding it to the YouTube video, so if you're watching this on YouTube right now, I was going to paste them in there, but They are a little bit graphic, and some people may be a little bit turned off and not want to see them. So what I'm going to do is just put them in the show notes. So whether or not you're listening to this on just the audio or the YouTube version, you can go afterwards, or if you're listening to this on YouTube, just open up a tab, go to the show notes, and there you'll find a copy of the Facebook post as well as the pictures of the snake, Samantha, both alive and during the post-mortem examination. So you can see how much fat tissue there actually was. I just didn't think some people would want to see it in the video. So it is separate from the video, but they are there for you in the show notes if you are interested in seeing them. And I highly recommend going to check them out. So real quick before we jump into the episode, if you are interested in finding the show notes, just head to animalsathome.network.com and click on the Animals at Home header. There you'll find the show notes for all the episodes that have been recorded. If you enjoyed the episode, share it on social media, Facebook or Instagram. That does really help us. If you are interested in an Animals at Home sweater or t-shirt, head to animalsathome.ca/shop and you can find yourself a shirt. $5 does automatically get donated to the Amazon Rainforest Conservancy. And if you would like to join us on Patreon, head to patreon.com/animalsathome and you'll have early access to the episodes and the opportunity to submit questions to upcoming guests. And finally, thank you so much to customreptilehabitats.com for sponsoring this episode of the podcast. You can find affiliate links in both the YouTube description as well as the show notes. All right, let's jump into the episode. Enjoy. All right, well, Dan, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for reaching out to me. I really appreciate this. I know this is going to be a fantastic conversation, so thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm very happy to be here.
You had messaged me probably a month and a half, 2 months, maybe more. Out of time is just blending into everything now. Maybe a couple months now, and you had made a post on Facebook about a Burmese python that passed away, and when you guys opened her up to sort of a necropsy, you saw lots of way more fatty tissue than you were expecting, and we're going to get into all that because I think it's an incredibly important topic. But let's rewind the clock a little bit. Let's tell me about how you got into reptiles in the first place. How did you begin in this hobby?
Sure. I feel like anybody who's really big in herpetoculture at my age, I'm 35. We all, well, maybe I shouldn't blanket statement it, but the classic, like I grew up catching frogs and snakes, blah, blah, blah. But one of my earliest memories was going to a place called Reptiland, which was in New York at the time. Clyde Peeling's Reptiland. There's 2 locations. Now there's only one, the original one in Pennsylvania, but there was one in a place called Cairo near where I live. And my parents would take me there. And I was about 5 years old. And the memory consists of seeing a king cobra in a huge, absolutely monstrous enclosure. It was awesome. And I got to see a Burmese python up close because somebody was doing a lecture. And I can never forget it because the Burmese python had blue, like opaque blue eyes. And, now we know it's like, oh, well, the snake was, in the middle of a shed cycle. But back then it was like the snake had blue eyes. It was amazing. And from that point on, I was pretty much hooked. We moved around a lot as a child. And for a few years, we lived on my grandfather's farm. And, outside of playing Super Nintendo growing up, like you're outside learning what insects bite and which ones don't, and catching frogs, catching snakes. My parents absolutely hated snakes. So, I'd always catch a whooping or a talking to, bringing home a garter snake, nothing even crazy. And then, that was pretty much it. I never really felt the attraction towards mammals, like as pets, like dogs and cats. They were just kind of like boring to me. They were too similar. Similar, come to find out, I really decided with the reptiles. I like them. They're the underdogs as far as like, most vertebrate animals go, I think in humans' eyes. So I love them. I started keeping officially, I would say right about like 10, 11 years old. And of course I couldn't get a snake, which I just wanted so badly. But I got a tokay gecko. Of all animals for my first animal. Wow. Yeah. And you can only imagine the learning curve on a tokay gecko as an 11, 12-year-old child. But I got used to it. I took a lot of bites, but I got used to it. And eventually I ended up with 3. I had a trio of tokay geckos. Oh, cool. They're beautiful animals. I still to this day love them. And it's just, they're a little aggressive. Yeah. So a lot of bites later. I did have 2 of them that were hand tame. So just working with them, no quick movements, but you could hold them and they wouldn't bite you. So I felt like that was a pretty good win. Yeah. And then from there, I finally convinced my parents to let me get a snake when I was 12 years old. It was a garter snake. And this is back when pet stores in New York were, well, I don't even know if they were really legally selling them, but I bought a garter snake from a pet store and I brought it home. And then I went out and I caught 3 more. And of course, so this is back in the 90s. So, I was a kid. I didn't know I shouldn't be like taking animals from the wild, but
yeah, we all did.
I know everybody. And by the time I was 13 years old, I had 52 garter snakes. 2 of the ones that I caught were females, and they were monstrous, man. They were like 3 foot plus females, and they had a couple litters, and my parents were just like, they had it up to their necks, and they're just like, okay, you can have snakes and other reptiles, but you just can't have this many.
Yeah.
And for the rest is pretty much history. I got into lots of colubrid snakes, king snakes, everything from, Alterna gray bands and Sonora Mountain king snakes and, the classic California king snake, I had everything, little lizards, Pac-Man frogs, you name it. And then eventually, got into bigger and crazier stuff as the years went on.
So did anything particularly lead you to the big snakes, or was it just, that's just a classic progression? Or do you think there was something about that early Burmese python that kind of always stuck in your memory?
I think it had something to do for sure with that early memory of the Burmese python, but there's something so captivating about the size and the power of a large constricting snake, any Burms, Afrox, retics, they're just awesome. Like they're so powerful. They command so much respect. And it's just, I think there's almost a part of me that's like, we've kind of dominated the planet as a species with our brains. But as far as brawn goes, there are still things out there that absolutely can overpower us and just we're nothing in the eyes of the strength comparison to a large constricting snake. And it's just, I don't know, in a way, it just makes your jaw drop and just be like, wow, like to see an 18-foot reticulated python and just be like, that's so many ribs, that's so many vertebrae, it's so much muscle.
Yeah.
So I think that's really what got me into them. I consider myself lucky through my teenage years. I had some, I guess you could call them mentors. Back then, I didn't really realize they were, but my 10th grade bio teacher, he was a reptile educator. He still is actually doing some reptile shows now. And so I got to handle big snakes and alligators with him. And then one of my best friends growing up, his father did falconry.
Oh, cool.
And he did lots of birds of prey shows, but he also included other reptiles. So, I mean, he had like 100+ pound alligator snapping turtle. He had alligators. He had Burmese pythons. And so, 15, 16 years old, you go to your friend's house and, he pulls a giant snapping turtle out of the tub. And he's a little guy. He's a scrawny guy. He couldn't get it back in the tub. So, me having to lift my first like real massive snapping turtle, I'm nervous. He's just like, oh, just pick it up, right behind the head by the carapace and just, pop it back in there. And I felt so badass, like, oh man, I can't wait to tell all my friends about this. Like, but yeah, the big stuff, I've just always been drawn to, I guess, just the sheer power, or, I mean, if we can make a joke about it, just a little wiener, I don't know. I don't know what it is.
Well, I think awesome is the right word to describe them. And, I have a couple of boas, and one of my boas she's not huge. She's like maybe 5.5 feet. But a couple weeks ago, she was kind of stuck under something. I let her crawl around and she got stuck under something. And of course, like I'm in a rush and I want her to get out so I can put her back in the enclosure. And they know when you're in a rush, so they mess with you. And she's just grabbing on everything, pulling out cables. And I'm just thinking like, it's insane how strong this snake is considering how small she is. Like she's not a big animal, but the strength you could feel, like, of course, I could overpower her, but at the same time, like I don't want to break her ribs or anything. So you're trying to like pull her gently, but you just can't imagine the power. So every time that happens to me with my boas, I think I just can't imagine what an 18-foot reticulated python must have as far as power goes. It must just be unbelievable.
It's one of those things, like so many people ask me, especially because, I'm an educator as well, traveling, doing shows, and, the kids or adults alike, like, what do you do? What do you do when you have an animal that large? Like, how do you restrain it? And I'm just like, well, you kind of give it recommendations on where you'd like it to go. Of course, you do your best. And, when you're bringing animals out to shows, you I've worked with them, since they were hatchlings for the most part. So they're very calm and mellow to begin with. But yeah, it's one of those things that, like, if they really want to go somewhere, you're going to be sweating.
Yeah.
You're going to be sweating really hard to restrain them or get them to stop doing whatever they're doing.
Yeah, it's truly amazing. So what was the first big snake that you got?
The first big snake I got is actually the topic of our conversation, Samantha.
Okay.
Yeah, she was actually the first big snake, and she was already a big snake when I got her. She was probably 9.5 feet at the time when I went and picked her up back in 2006. And then from there, I got into reticulated pythons, and I got an African rock python, and then, green anacondas, and just kind of ran the gambit. I mean, I did like the big four. I never had any amethystine scrub pythons or anything like that, though they are awesome. Yeah. I wouldn't mind maybe in the future, but not right now.
So
sure.
As far as right now, what do you have?
So I'm actually going through a really weird time. Some between like what I have going on personally in my own life, and some new regulations that hit with the state. I'm actually rehoming most of my collection, because everything that I own are on licenses through New York State, because I do educational lectures. So what I currently have, I still have 2 reticulated pythons, my male green anaconda, and then everything else from there are pretty much native animals. I have North American wood turtles. I have 4 adult North American wood turtles. I have a Blandings turtle, a big old common snapping turtle, the classics. I still have a Southern Pacific rattlesnake, an Eastern copperhead, and a timber rattlesnake as well, and a Colombian black and white tegu. I think that might be it. I think I've hit on everything.
That's a good mix.
Yeah, it's all kinds of stuff. I've already rehomed a ton of animals. I had more native snakes before that, because in my lectures, my first half of all my lectures were just on native reptiles that you could find, because I just find that to be a very important thing to talk about. Of
course, yeah.
But in the past, like I've had 4 green anacondas. I've had numerous reticulated pythons, a couple of Burmese pythons. Only ever one African rock though. And yeah, so I've gotten plenty of hand-on experience keeping and even breeding at times the larger snakes and some other things.
Okay.
I'm sorry. And an Angolan python. I cannot leave him out because I love him.
Oh, and you still have that?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Those are cool. I love Angolan pythons.
Well, he's staying forever. Yeah. He's definitely not going, because he's not a restricted species.
Yeah. Okay. That's awesome. Well, why don't we jump into Samantha? You already kind of touched on her a little bit. And so maybe for those of you who are, the listeners maybe aren't familiar with her, you mentioned her a little bit, but can you, she's a Burmese python, an albino Burmese python. You got her, that was your first big snake, you're saying, and you actually got her while she was already quite big. You didn't want to grow with the snake. You just went all in.
It was a funny thing. The family had reached out to me one day through Craigslist, of all things, back in 2006. And, they were afraid of her, is essentially what it came down to. She would strike the glass of the enclosure that they had her in. They had kids, and they just didn't really know how to handle a larger constricting snake. I mean, they were keeping her in a modified display shelf, like for jewelry and stuff. Wow. Too. Yeah, the enclosure was not adequate. Let's just put it that way. And so, I went and I picked her up, and I already had a bunch of reptiles, but this is kind of like my first step into the big snake world. And I'd handled snakes much, much larger than this. So it's not my first time handling them, but owning them, actually, it is. So yeah, I got her. She was about 10 years old already when I got her, and probably 9.5 feet. And I mean, she was a big girl already. I mean, she had that classic Burmese python girth, just all around, just a great snake. She was hissy, but she was never bitey. It was the weirdest thing. Like, she was a sweetheart. I think they were just afraid of a larger snake. I don't know.
Yeah, well, there's something about the sound of a hissing snake that makes it doesn't matter who you are, it still gives you the chills. Like, even me, when my boas are hissing, I'm like, damn, I could see why that would freak you out, especially if you're not a snake person.
Absolutely. And the bigger they get, the louder and longer it goes on for,
Yeah. So did she never struck her, but maybe she struck, but she never bit. She had a relatively mellow disposition.
She was a sweetheart through and through. She really didn't have a mean bone in her body. She did bite me once. It was completely my fault, being an idiot during feeding time.
Yeah.
Go figure. That was back in like 2008. So it was only a couple years into even having her. And it was a great experience. As far as experiences go, it wasn't at the time because she had actually gotten a hold of my hand and constricted my right arm to my right leg. Oh. And at the time she was probably, I'd say I put her right around like 12 foot. Didn't feel good.
No,
it was a really bad time. Like, I knew I was fine. She didn't have my neck or anything. And my two roommates at the time, they were home, so it wasn't a big deal, but lots of blood, lots of swelling. It was something else. Let's just put it that way when she finally let go. But to feel the power of constriction was just unbelievable.
Yeah.
I feel like as the blood was coming down my shoulder and going into my arm, where she was, it was just like I could feel it stop. It became nauseating. And if you've ever been electrocuted, it kind of felt like that too, when a big snake really is like, oh, you're food, I'm going to squeeze you, this is happening.
Oh,
and
that's
it was
interesting. So you're actually probably getting some nerve compression or something that's giving you a little bit of zap.
Yep.
Wow.
It had to have been. It was really, really intense. And then like I said, I started getting this really crazy feeling of nausea, the tingling in your cheeks, right before you vomit. It was really, really crazy, but I wouldn't say it was overly painful. It may have been shock, but like, it just wasn't overly painful, but it was a feeling all in itself. And like, when you thought she couldn't squeeze any harder, she could. So
it's like really all your ancestral genetics are just like, that is the one thing that us monkeys do not want, is a snake constricting around you. And it's just like all the alarm bells going off.
Oh, exactly. It was terrible. And of course, like, she lets go because obviously I'm way too large for her to eat. I get her back in the enclosure and I just keep feeding her like nothing happened.
Yeah.
Of course my hand is swollen up and I couldn't barely bend my fingers. They were big sausages. She only got me with like 8 teeth. Wow. That was it. I had 8 pin marks and it was a clean in and out. Like, it didn't tear or anything. I couldn't ask for a better large snake constricting bite.
So overall, 9 out of 10 experience.
Nowadays, yeah, great. But I've taken hits from smaller snakes. Like I have a permanent scar on my knuckle from like an 8-foot reticulated python that decided to do the same thing. But it wasn't a feeding error. It was just a retic and a mood. And, I have a scar on my forearm from my Nile crocodile that I had. It just... Yeah, I got some battle scars.
Yeah. So you got her in 2006, you're saying, and then you've had her for about just over a decade or more, I guess.
Yeah, I had her for about 12 years before she finally died on me. And through those 12 years, I use her in lectures. We went up and down the East Coast because I'd go down to North Carolina every year. So she went down to North Carolina with me at least once, I think twice. To do like a big public show at a museum down there in Raleigh, the Museum of Natural Sciences, North Carolina. There we go. Sorry, I had to remember it for a second. It's been a while. Great place. I highly suggest if anybody's in the Raleigh area, they go check it out because it's a living museum.
Oh, cool.
And they do cater to reptile specialties. So they have some really awesome living reptiles on display, including a bog turtle, which for me, that's really exciting.
Oh, cool. That is definitely on the bucket list now.
Absolutely. Oh, it's a great place. And they have a second building now, and they have, dinosaur skeletons. They have the most complete Acrocanthosaurus. If you're a big dinosaur nerd, it's an awesome place to go. I highly recommend it.
Awesome. Okay. That's great. So you had her for that time. Can you tell me a little bit about how you were keeping her? And then maybe into the end, I know that in that post that you made on Facebook, you talked about noticing some illness kind of up until before she passed away. So maybe you could talk about that as well.
Absolutely. So her enclosures had evolved over the years, going from that, like I said, that modified like jewelry case into, I built like a big wooden enclosure and then into like big, like 8-foot Bowmasters that went to like even bigger 8-foot Centex. And that's, that was her last enclosure she was in. And it's one of those things. I mean, we'll probably get on it later, but those are the enclosures that she was in. In hindsight, entirely too small. But back then, I was just like, "Oh, this is fine. This is what everybody does."
It was the standard, and it's still a lot. Yeah. And like we said, we will get into this a little bit later, but it still is a lot of ways the standard.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So in my mind, I was doing great. Just that was happening. Her feeding regimen was, when I first got her. Oh, you're gonna cringe. I was feeding her about once a week, and she was eating well. I would probably say, like I was getting jumbo rats, and she'd probably eat 5 to 10 jumbo rats in a clip. She's a big Burmese python.
Yeah.
And she would poop. And my life revolved around the reptiles, so I was constantly cleaning poop and this and that. So I'm like, oh yeah, keep feeding her, whatever. The bigger the animal, the more impressive it is for a lecture.
Yeah.
And then after a couple of years of that, probably around 2009, I started slowing her down. I was feeding her twice a month, which even still for an adult snake is just like, oh my goodness. And again, like the same amount or even a little more per feeding because she was bigger. And I'm thinking, well, she's bigger. She needs more food,
Yeah.
And then by the end of it, I'd probably say the last 4 or 5 years she was with me. I was probably only feeding her once every 4 to 6 weeks. So it's finally like finding that sweet spot. But I was feeding her entirely too much in a sitting. Mm-hmm. And that I think was, among other things, enclosure size as well. But, just she would sit. I mean, there would be times I'd have rabbits. And one time she ate probably close to 40 pounds in rabbits.
Wow.
And I just let her eat them.
Yeah.
Because she was big and she looked for more afterwards.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we know why the snake does. They don't know when their next meal's coming, so they're going to gobble up everything they can in one sitting because it might be another year until they eat. You never know. So she would just eat and eat and eat. But I would say, I'd go to my rodent dealer and I would probably at least always have 20 jumbo rats with her name on it. And she never refused. She was a classic Burmese python. They don't refuse food.
Just carburetor.
Oh yeah, just right on down. I could pile feed her because everything was frozen thawed, So I would just take like 10 rats at a time, put a pile in there, and she would just eat them one by one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So yeah.
So when you started stretching out the meals, was that because you were starting to think, okay, maybe I am feeding too frequently, or what was the sort of philosophy for starting to stretch them out?
So that was, you pretty much hit the nail on the head. I was starting to realize I was reading more online. You have certain, papers that get published and certain people start talking about obesity in the reptile hobby. And it was something that I never really thought about because when what I considered power feeding back then was like people who just always like every 5 to 7 days, big meal, get them big, giant snakes that are 15 feet long, but they have a head that's only 2 inches long. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I was ignorant to the fact that I was power feeding. I didn't realize it. But I thought because all these other guys that you see online that I won't name certain names, but these people who are just like pumping these animals, man, and just getting them huge, like a certain person that's, big YouTube celebrity with his giant retics and all, like,
yes,
I figured I was just doing right by the animal. And there was a kind of dogma back then, and probably and still today, the same dogma persists in that if you were able to feed your animals, especially with big snakes, if you're able to maintain a collection of larger constricting snakes and you were able to feed them really well and they were well fed, you can see they're nice and chunky, they're big animals, that was like a badge of prestige. Because look at me, it was like a flex. It was just like the weirdest flex. Like I have enough money to be able to feed these things all the time. Look at how big and healthy my animals are, this and that. And I started kind of questioning that about 4 to 5 years ago. Well, before she died, 4 to 5 years before she died. And that's why I started slowing her down. And I just like, she's huge. I don't need to keep feeding her all the time. What am I doing? You know? So yeah. And it just, even up to the point around when she did finally die, I was aware. I'm like, I bet you this animal's way overweight.
Yeah.
And I had that like inkling in my head. But like, again, like I'd have her out of her enclosure all the time. I'd have her going around like for the most part, up until probably about a year before she died. She didn't show any symptoms that would raise alarm for me. You know what I mean? And I guess while we're getting there, about a year before she died, maybe a year and a half, I don't really remember. She started to cough up phlegm. And this is a really strange thing, because why would a healthy snake start coughing up a bunch of phlegm? And it's a classic. Now, imagine this snake. She was 16 feet, 3 inches long. So she was not a small animal by any means. And she would open her mouth and you would see like the body would expand and it would contract really hard, because snakes don't have a diaphragm. They just have to expel all the air out of that lung. And it looked like she was choking on something. Mouth would open up and she just, that big, release of air. And then like, you'd get 2 or 3 of them. And on the last one, it would just be a giant gob of just shit would come out, and it just phlegmy looking stuff. Now, there was another little like weird dogma that Burmese pythons, if they ever get a respiratory infection, it never goes away. And this is another one of those things. And she did have a respiratory infection that she was treated for back in like 2007, 2008. And, she made a full recovery from it. And like, that's what I was being told, is that like these snakes, they get the RIs and then they have weird issues every now and again.
Like it'll reoccur once in a while type thing.
Yeah. But like, it's warm weather. It's like, I don't understand why she's coughing up phlegm in warm weather. It's just like, oh, maybe the humidity's too high. Like it might bumped up. She might have like flipped water. Who knows? And so that should have been like a big red flag. But because like my concerns were quelled at the time, I never really thought twice about it.
Yeah.
Coming from guys who have experience with big snakes, twice as long as me, maybe 3 times as long. So it's like, okay, well, this is just what it is.
Yeah.
And then, I knew something was up, because I went to feed her one day and she showed all the telltale signs of wanting food. She ate 2 rats and then stopped, and she didn't want any more rats. And I thought that was just really odd, because like, this was a snake that like, it was all or nothing. Either she was going to eat or she didn't eat. So it was just kind of like, okay. And then about 2 days later, I walked into my reptile room and I saw her laying a certain way. And like, as somebody who I've had so many reptiles through the years,
you just know,
like, a dead snake when you see one. And, I ran up to the enclosure and she like she was kind of like, her head was laying on the side with her mouth slightly open. She had regurgitated the 2 rats I had fed her. They didn't even look like they were even touched really, digestion wise. And, she was dead, and it was a whole thing. And I mean, like I opened it up, because I'm like, oh, is she still, like, what's going on? Like, can I save her? And I went to, pull her out. And like, as I lifted her up, any remaining air in her lung just kind of out. And it sounded like she took a breath. And I was just like hopeful for that 1 second, like, we'll just go to the vet right now. We'll get you checked out, like, whatever. But no, that unfortunately was not the case. And she was dead. And I was very distraught, because, it's hard to put into words and not like sit here for 3 hours telling you about it. Mm-hmm. I love the animal. I love all my animals. They're always my pets first and foremost. And it was like, I don't know. It was really, I don't want to say traumatic because that sounds very dramatic, but at the same time, it was just like, dude, oh my God, like what just happened? Like I've only had her for 12 years. She's like 22 years old. Like she's not young, but she's not like old, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it just like hit me like a ton of bricks. She was a really well-known snake, from doing lectures, all, elementary schools and camps and everything. Like people I didn't know knew her by name, by Samantha. And all my friends, friends to acquaintances, they knew this snake. If anybody knew any of the animals I had, it was her. She was she was a big deal. She was a huge animal, but she was huge, in a bad way.
Yes.
Which inevitably caused her death. So, I measured her. I pulled her out. I was crying. I was crying at the time, pulling my tape measure out, like, and I measured her, and that's how I got her length and her weight. I never got an actual like real weight on her, but as somebody who has lifted many weights in the past, and I got a few other people who big, strong, burly guys, to kind of weigh in on it. I would easily guesstimate her final weight probably ranged between 180 and 200 pounds.
Yeah. So big girl.
Very, very big.
So I agree with you. I think that is a traumatic experience. Like you said, it's your pet. It's a sad experience, and and I do appreciate you being so open and honest about it too. Because I think a lot of people, the first reaction is to hide, and I think even you were saying I think before we actually started recording that you didn't really want to share the story at all, or it took you a while to share the story because there is emotion attached to it. So what led you to do the necropsy? And maybe you could tell me that story, because I think. I know obviously you were curious and maybe that was most of it, but I think for some people they just want, okay, like let's bury her, let's just get this over with. But you had some curiosity there. You seemed like you needed to know something.
Yes, there were two big reasons why I ended up doing it. The first one was exactly what you said. I was curious because I wanted to know, like, how overweight was she? I knew she was overweight, but I wasn't sure how much she was. And the second reason was, as morbid as this might sound, I skin and gut snakes that die, burn. Like I find dead animals and I bring them home to skeletonize them. I just like skeletons and skins and stuff like that. I'll make wet specimens of animals that have died. I have a chest freezer full of dead animals, things I've collected, and old pets for over the years.
See, to reptile people, that's totally normal.
Exactly.
Just a sort of a fringe side of reptile people. That's all part of the same package.
Exactly. And I'm a big anatomy guy. I think just even as boring and monotonous as a snake skeleton might be, there's a beauty there in the repetition, and it just to see it is amazing, and to know that just vertebrae and just ribs, no limbs at all. And muscles, just that does everything for that animal. Yeah. Everything that animal needs to do is right there in two different kinds of bones for the most part. I don't have words. It's just like, wow, how can you not be in love with an animal like this? Because it's just like, they have no arms, they have no legs. Yeah. They get around just fine. They get around better than most animals, honestly. And it's just like, I don't know. The hatred doesn't make sense to me. Yeah. I mean, I can understand, but as I'm a snake guy, so of course it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, exactly. So take me up to that moment where you guys started the dissection. What did you find when you opened her up?
So it was me and my Uncle Pete, and he's not my real uncle. I just probably throw it out there, but I call him Uncle Pete. He's a older gentleman. I don't want to sound offensive at all, if Uncle Pete ever even listens to this, I love you, Uncle Pete. But he's an ornithologist, and he works in the vertebrate zoology ornithology section of the Museum of Natural History down in New York City. And he's an adjunct professor and everything. Smart guy. And he was like, I'll help you skin the snake. And I'm like, all right, perfect. So we started opening her up, and we probably got, and I know you can see it in some of the pictures that I took. I think we got about 18 inches down her neck, or down the body, I should say. And that's when I found my first fatty deposit. It was small, but it was like a little white marshmallow. Wasn't big, and it was just one. I'm like, that's not good, because it's like we're like literally 18 inches, 2 feet into the snake. Now, for those who aren't aware, where snakes typically deposit fat, it's in the lower part of their body, closer to their cloaca. Excuse me, and they don't normally store very much of it. Mm-hmm. As we continued to go down her body, probably after that first little fatty deposit, started finding more, not even a foot deeper, and more became tons, and tons became an atrocious amount, to the point where, and again, like you can see it in the photos, but you couldn't see her internal organs. It was all like the colymic fatty deposit. It was just like one giant sheet of weird looking scallops or marshmallows. It was, I wasn't in denial when I saw it, but I was just like still so shocked. Like, I cannot believe she has this much fat stored up in her body. And of course, like, hindsight's always 20/20. You go back and be like, well, duh, idiot, you fed her so much. What were you thinking? You're so dumb, dude. You killed your own snake, dumbass. Like, what are you doing? But I couldn't believe it. And it went all the way down to her cloaca. And it was just like, wow. Like, we had to cut through the fatty deposits to like look at her stomach and her intestines and everything. We could see her heart. Her heart wasn't covered somehow. I don't know how, but her heart was not covered. And so we took her heart out and we looked at her heart, and the heart had a giant white mass on it. It wasn't a fatty deposit. It was scar tissue. And what happens with a heart attack, which is like her cause of death, you get scar tissue buildup on a heart, like from blockage. And when you get a blockage of oxygenated blood, cells will start to die, and it'll build up like this scar tissue. And that scar tissue isn't like the rest of the cardiac muscle. It can't, it's not elastic. Mm-hmm. It's very, very rigid. And, that in itself causes complications, so that was probably building up over the years of all the heavy feeding and not getting enough exercise. And, and that was it. So my Uncle Pete said, yeah, she definitely died of a heart attack. I then reached out to a veterinarian. His name's Dr. James Madoff. I hope I did not butcher his last name. Great guy. He's a younger vet. And he's definitely up and coming, smart guy. I mean, he's like my age, when I say young, but like, definitely, way into reptiles, reptile specialist, just loves them. And I sent him all the pictures, and I told him about everything that was happening. And I asked him about the phlegm cough ups. And he said, yeah, it sounds like a myocardial infarction. The constriction of the internal organs from just the sheer amount of fat would have constricted the lung. It could have caused fluid buildup in the lung because of that constriction. Mm. And so there was no relief for her. And it made me feel like an utter piece of shit, because I'm just like, wow. So not only did I kill my snake with love, but I killed her with love nonetheless, or killed her nonetheless. I don't know how uncomfortable she could have been those last couple of years, maybe even longer. Like, I have no idea. She didn't seem like she was in any discomfort until she started coughing up the phlegm. And it's just, it sucks, because I know I'm smarter than that, and, but man, I was just told the wrong things.
And you just follow what people are doing.
If they have more experience than you, you typically trust in what they have to say. And that's what I did. Listen, we all have egos, some bigger than others. And I'd be the first to tell you that I certainly have a little bit of an ego, and just whatever. I'm that kind of a guy, but I'm definitely, I'm able to be humbled, and I'm able to listen as well. And I shouldn't have in this case, you know?
Well, and one other thing I think to point out is she didn't have, as you had said, I haven't seen the photos of her yet, but the classic sort of rings that really obese snakes get, you know, like you see a really fat snake to have like donut rings going around their whole body. They just sort of, you can tell when there's some really, really fat snakes. And according to you, she didn't have those telltale signs of obesity, which is pretty frightening for the animals that are showing, you know, optically obese signs. That is terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely. So like she did show some signs, like, you know, like how thick she was going up to her cloaca and then how thin her tail would be.
Right.
But again, the taper wasn't terrible. She was a massive snake to begin with. And even with reticulated pythons, when they get massive, when they get like lengths 18, 19, 20 feet long, they do get girth. It happens with an animal that large. They get big. And so she didn't have the rings, which is interesting. I'm not 100% sure on this, but I am 90% confident in those rings. So the snake doesn't deposit fat outside of the muscle that I know of. The fat's always deposited inside the body cavity, around the organs and everything.
Yeah.
So those rings that you see are actually the rib cage being pushed out.
Interesting.
And that's what causes the dent in the spine. So in very obese snakes, you'll see
down the back.
Yeah, you won't have a ridge. You have a valley.
Right.
And you'll see the ribs will stick up because the fat is pushing out so hard. So it's constricting the internal organs, but it's pushing out and making the bones actually
move,
not change shape, but like change their normal position in which they should be in. But yeah, she didn't have, like, she would get some rolls when she curled up tightly. She did have a bit of the indent, but she also, when she was lying, like stretching out, if I had her out in the grass or just like out in the house, she wasn't this giant flat tire. And because of that, because I had already seen so many like wildly obese, like retics and Burmese pythons and anacondas, I'm just like, well, she's not that big, so it can't be that bad, right?
Yeah.
Incorrect. And the scariest part about that, when you finally get that wake-up call, you're just like, listen, I probably shouldn't stay quiet about this, because it's a very, in the big snake community, it's kind of it's still a very taboo thing to talk about, obesity. Because it's a pissing contest, you know, and having the bigger snake, you know, it's just like, oh, look at me. For some people, not all people. So I don't want to make blanket statements, but yeah. So I see all these examples of truly obese animals. And then I look at my snake and I'm like, well, she might be overweight, but she's not that big. So I must be good.
Yeah.
Nope.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, exactly. You admittedly knew she had some extra weight on her, but you did not think it would reach into the morbidly obese, which is what it was. And so tell me about the motivation to make the Facebook post, because like you said, I think it's important to talk about the subject, but it would be difficult to talk about. This is something that is kind of hush hush in the big snake community.
Yeah, absolutely. So it took me a while. It took me about 6 months after we actually had skinned and gutted her and everything. And just a quick topic on that before I roll into this. Her, the fatty deposits on her, she probably had like 40, 50 pounds of fat on her.
Wow.
So like almost a quarter of her weight was just fat. So even a 16-foot Burmese python should not be weighing 200 pounds. Yeah. It should be weighing about half that. Maybe a little over 100 pounds. I don't know, depending on when it fed. But I just wanted to throw that out there. So yeah, it took me 6 months to make the post, and there was a weird fear because I'm putting myself out there in a very vulnerable spot of being like, hey, I messed up. I killed my own snake, but I made the mistake. I did the experience for you. Mm-hmm. Don't do what I did. Save your animals. Because again, like bro, I'll tell you, if I get drinking and somebody brings up that stupid snake, I'll start crying. Yeah. I get real emotional for that dumb animal. It's so ridiculous. But like, I just didn't want people to have to go through that. it, and nobody should have to really go through that, we should know, and it should be out there. And it's just something that isn't talked about at all. It just isn't.
And it's so easy to do. That's the killer. It's so easy to do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh man, we're getting into the real greasy stuff now, baby. So yeah, I was afraid to be vulnerable, and really put myself on blast, because that's what I was doing. And that's what I'm even kind of doing now. Like, I'm looking back and just being like, dude, I was dumb. I was an idiot. I thought I knew what I was doing, but no, I didn't, and I just had to get it out there. I had to get it off my chest, for one, but I also just wanted to warn people and let them know. And when I posted it, a lot of my friends, it was on Facebook, and a lot of my friends were the first to respond, oh my God, I'm so sorry, blah, blah, blah. Like, people were posting pictures of her in the comments, their experience with her, like, everything was very positive. And then I started noticing, like, oh, this post got shared 20 times. Oh, now it's shared 50 times. Oh, this post got shared like 300 times. And like, the comment list started going. It just kept going, and it was just gaining so much momentum. And all these random people are commenting on it. I never expected it to go as far as it did. And obviously you ended up seeing the post.
Yeah. I don't even know where I saw it, but it popped up somewhere.
Mm-hmm. It got everywhere.
Yeah.
I think it literally got everywhere except for big snake groups.
Which kind of makes sense. Just like they have that iron shield, it's just like every group has their own sort of ideology that they don't want to be broken with. So it's like, poke all that information that contends with what we want to believe out of here. And I guess that could be what happened. But it definitely made the rounds. And as far as the response was going, you were probably expecting, like you said, to get blasted, but I think you probably saw a lot more positive response than you were expecting.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say probably 90 to 95% of the comments were just like, hey, I'm so sorry. Thank you for sharing this. This is really valuable information. Oh, a whole slew of like things like that. Obesity is running rampant in a reptile community. Like, thank you for getting this out there. And then there were some assholes, that are just like, you didn't know she was obese, fucking idiot.
Yeah.
Sorry. But and so you had those, but I stopped reading comments after like 100. I'm just like, I can't do it.
No,
I'm not going to do that to myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, which was very good. But every now and again, every like 6-7 months, I'll get a random notification on Facebook, like random person shared that post. Yeah. And I'm like, really? And then one person shares it, it picks up steam again. And I'm like, I cannot believe this is going as far as it did.
Yeah.
I'm very happy that it did, because I'm very happy to talk about it, and again, like kind of issue the warning to like, hey, guys, adult snakes don't need to eat all the time. Well, adult large constricting snakes don't need to eat all the time. Like, let's relax.
Yeah, well, I think a part of it is sort of the vulnerability that you showed posting that, and the honesty and saying, "Hey guys, this is on me. This is my mistake. I want to share this with you guys." I think that immediately disarms most of the trolls, because it's not like you're trying to hide it or say like, "Well, this wasn't my fault." You're just saying, "This is the situation. This is what we found, and I really want this to be a lesson for other people to start thinking about things in a deeper way." And that was sort of the exact thing I thought when I saw that. I'm like, wow, It was just amazing how much fat there was for the fact that externally it didn't look that bad. And I think it's definitely a red flag. And like you said, in the big snake community, people are trying to grow their snakes, and that's the goal. And it's just, we have to change that mentality.
Absolutely. Everybody's in such a rush. There's such a rush. And it's like, my dudes, these snakes live upwards of 20 to 30 plus years. You got time.
Yeah.
You got plenty of time. You got a third of your lifespan to get this snake to be big and to enjoy it in all of its monstrous size. There shouldn't be a rush. And I get it. I totally get it. When you have a hatchling that fits in the palm of your hand, and, to watch that grow into something that, lies across your shoulders, goes down your body, and still, plenty of length on each side of you. It's if you're into big snakes, who wouldn't want that? It's just, it's an amazing feeling, to be in a presence of an animal that large, that has the strength to just absolutely and utterly destroy you, but doesn't.
Yes.
So yeah.
Well, and I guess the thing is, like, a big snake is going to eventually be a big snake. That's what you're saying. You just have to have the patience. So if you take 20 years to grow, you're going to get your huge snake, but it just takes time. That's simple as that.
Exactly. And it's really, if you want to get into the thick of it, like, big snakes are just like any other animal. Genetics honestly determine overall size more so than like feeding regimen will. You'd be surprised. Some snakes have it in them. Some Burms will hit 18 feet. Some Burms, 13, 14 feet. And that's another thing. People are really, really bad at guesstimating the length of their snake.
Yeah. It's always a 25-foot snake.
Yeah, like everybody, you read all the records and stuff like, oh, the biggest reticulated python ever found was 32 feet long. It's like, no, it wasn't.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't. I've handled 20-foot reticulated pythons, and let me tell you how massive a 20-foot reticulated python is. Yeah. It's just, I'm a big guy, right? I'm just a big boy all around, I got thick legs and everything. And to just have a reticulated python that is thicker than my upper thigh.
It's just amazing.
But it's just massive, with a head on it that's just absolutely like muscular and massive, and just it is intensely large. Even for somebody who's used to it, when you're not used to seeing an animal that large and you come across it, you still take a step back and go, wow, absolutely beautiful. Like it's awe-inspiring. It's a thing of myth.
Yeah.
But they absolutely do not get these crazy lengths that people get. I think really a max length on a reticulated python is probably anywhere between the 22 and 25 foot range.
Yeah, which, I mean, if you're getting to that 25, that's an old animal. So it's been around for a while. Hopefully it's not something that's been fed for, over and over. So I think let's jump into the big snake, because I think we've kind of covered the feeding thing. And I think that's a good warning for people to just, whatever you're keeping, we can't, obviously you and I can't advise people on how to feed their snakes because there's way too much species variability and whatnot. I think in the outro of this podcast, I'm going to lay out a few kind of general rules that people can use. We won't talk about it now because they're just sort of basic stuff that would be just me rambling on for 15 minutes. So for listeners, if you want to go to the end, I'll have a little bit there for you as far as, making sure the enclosures are set up right and everything to make sure you're burning calories and all that. But it's just, I think your post really sounded the alarm in a great way and started the conversation about that. So let's jump into just big snakes in general and keeping big snakes. Like you were kind of alluding to earlier, there are some old sort of ways that are still stuck in the ether of keeping big snakes. And so what do you see? Like, what are some changes that need to be made, and what are some places where that community is lacking?
Well, dogmatic practices, baby. I took notes because my brain just runs tangents all day.
I got notes everywhere.
Oh, good. I have to keep myself on track so we don't go like way over time here. I have to say, let's start with enclosure size. Mm-hmm. That's one bullet point I have. I think the industry standard at this point is lengthwise on enclosures, 6 to 8 foot. Whether it's a Vision, whether it's an animal plastic, a Centec, it doesn't matter. It's 6 to 8 foot. And it's just like, I don't know how we arrived at those arbitrary numbers. Let's just say 8 foot. I don't know how we arrived at that arbitrary number. I think just as far as like building materials go, 8 foot, it just works out. If you're making things out of wood,
sheet of plywood, 8 feet. Yeah,
exactly. And that's how it works. But the thing that really irks me about 8 foot enclosures, now an 8 foot enclosure is a very big enclosure. I think most people who keep reptiles would not even have ample space without like eating into like their living room or bedroom or something to even put an 8 foot enclosure.
Yeah.
But one thing that really irks me is that most 8 foot enclosures on the market are only 2 feet deep.
Right.
Now, let's say you have a 10 foot reticulated python. You're like, oh, I'm feeling like a big boy. I'm putting them into an 8 foot by 2 foot enclosure. This is great. It's like, well, the snake's already 2 feet longer than the enclosure and it's 2 feet wide.
Yeah.
So like, the snake, it curls up, it's touching each side of the enclosure.
Yeah.
And it's just like, dude. And then most people, I don't want to say most people, but there are a lot of people, like, again, 8 foot, you're done. You're done getting enclosures. You don't need to worry about it.
That's your big one. Like you're done upgrading.
Exactly. You have hit the king size. And maybe if you have a snake you really like, you'll go out of your way and build like a custom, like 10 foot by 4 foot or, whatever. And we can cover size dimensions as well, because something also with big snakes that's not talked about, and I think with a lot of reptiles not talked about, is height.
Yeah.
8 foot by 2 foot enclosures. And then people, you got 13, 14, 15 foot plus snakes in these enclosures. They can't even curl up. You know what I mean? Like they're so tightly curled, which means if they're doing that, how are they properly thermoregulating? And if they can't even thermoregulate properly, I imagine the snake probably lives slightly stressed out all the time.
Of course, yeah.
And so 8 foot by 2 foot, it's got to go. That's a stupid option. I hate, unless you're giving your corn snake or something like an amazing enclosure. It's just, as far as big snakes go, gotta go.
Yeah.
8 foot by 3 foot is also a standard. And again, I'm not mad at 8 foot by 3 foot, but putting a giant snake into that is still just like, we're finding out, man, they have so many not only physical, but even psychological benefits to the snake being able to stretch out straight, or at least mostly straight. And, I still kick myself because, dude, I still have 8 foot enclosures. And it's just like, I need to be building 16 foot enclosures, which is something, we can get into later on, but and I need massive enclosures. Like I'm done with these 8 footers. Like they're great enclosures, but for a 16, 17 foot retic, is it really a great enclosure? Like, will the snake live in it? Absolutely. Will the snake be healthy in it? Absolutely. Depending on what activities you might do with it, if you're constantly pulling the snake out for exercise. But also, let's be real and honest with ourselves. If you have a collection of, say, even 20 reticulated pythons, which is honestly child's play compared to some of the breeders out there, there's no way you're pulling all 20 of those retics out of their enclosures for proper enrichment and exercise.
Exactly.
And so it's just like, man, we got to do better just from enclosures, first of all. And again, I'm just as guilty about it. Like I'll call myself out. I'll be the first person to call myself out on it. I've already rehomed a lot of my bigger snakes. And in a sense, like as painful as it is, my hand was kind of forced. Again, I alluded to new regulations happening to where I live and whatnot. But, a lot of it's just I need them to go somewhere where hopefully they'll go into bigger enclosures. You know what I mean?
You do the math and you go, okay, 10 big snakes, 16 foot enclosures. I have no room in my house.
Yeah. What are you going to do? And how much money is that going to cost? The price of lumber right now, it's out of control.
Yeah, exactly.
So good luck. And PVC is just as bad.
Yeah. Well, and that's the really interesting thing is that we got stuck on that 8 foot metric, and that was the last 20 years, we'll say. And during that time, people, like you said, are collecting these animals and they're kind of using that 8 foot length in their head. And eventually you just have so many animals. And once you do realize, wow, a reticulated python really needs a 16 foot enclosure at least, and really needs a good amount of height, you're stuck. It's like we just kind of blew up the hobby there without thinking enough about it.
Absolutely. And let me tell you, I was told many, many times that, reticulated pythons start off semi-arboreal, and as they get larger, they climb less. Bullshit. You throw a big enough log in there that snake can climb on, one of the first things it's going to do, it's a new object, so the snake's going to check it out, it's going to climb on it. It might not climb on it all the time, but it's going to climb on it. Yeah. I guarantee you, 17 foot retic, it's going to climb.
Yeah.
It's just going to climb. That's what they do. You see giant anacondas down in Brazil, and they're climbing out on logs to bask with a big giant meal in their belly. We're talking 15, 16 foot green anacondas. We see it in the wild.
Yeah.
And the reason why we don't see it in captivity is because we're not giving these enclosure sizes big enough to see these natural behaviors. We're not putting things in them to enrich the snake. So our snakes are just sitting there bored. Just what do we do?
Yeah. Nowhere to go, nothing to do.
Exactly. And I'll sit here and tell you, I subscribe to the sterile box theory of keeping for a long time. And now, like, honestly, like my Angolan python I use as a perfect example. I have him in a 6 foot by 3 foot vision. It's 18 inches high. And I use cardboard boxes. Now, aesthetically, might not be like the nicest looking thing, but these guys, you know, they're out on like rock steps in Angola and Namibia. Oh my goodness, my pronunciation. I'm sorry. And you know, they're going to be out climbing. They're going to estivate during the day, during the hottest parts of the day. Then they're going to come out. They're going to climb around. They're going to search for food. They're going to search for basking areas. And the instant I started giving him all these objects to climb on, to hide underneath, unless he's out, if he's out, he's climbing around. Yeah. And otherwise, he's hidden. You know, a happy snake is a snake that's not out. You know, it's so funny to see. Like, exactly. I don't know.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing is that the decor doesn't have, I always say, provide natural decor. And what I mean by that is not provide it to look natural, because it's not everybody's thing. Provide it so it acts in the way that they can interact with it naturally. So if they climb, you know, provide some climbing branches. Does that mean you have to go to the woods and grab sticks? No, you could do that, but you could also build a climbing structure out of PVC and give the animal some room to climb. It doesn't really matter. It's the behavior that matters, not the aesthetics. Like you said, you know, cardboard box, it might not be a zoo level, something to take a picture in a magazine, but it still acts the same for the snake, which is the most important thing.
Exactly. And we get a lot of deliveries here, especially since COVID, you know.
Yeah, Amazon Prime.
yeah, Amazon Prime, baby. So there's no shortage of cardboard boxes. And because of that, it's like, oh, all right, they defecate. It gets on the box. The box soaks up some urine, whatever. Toss it out, throw a new box in.
And then there's some slight enclosure change as well, because it's going to be a different box, different height, different size. And
yep. Different scent. It's a new scent. The animal. It's just those little tidbits of enrichment to really benefit the animal and to get, you know, the gears turning inside their head.
Exactly.
Instead of just like the same old thing over and over. And you know, again, I'm somebody who's got still, I think by most standards, a fairly large collection. That word collection. You guys had a podcast on it, and it's like, oh, I hate using that word too. Yeah. But you know, I have a lot of reptiles, and when you have spent, all the money that you have on like 8-foot enclosures or 6x3 visions, like these enclosures aren't cheap. I've spent thousands and thousands of dollars on enclosures. And then somebody's going to come along, some 22-year-old kid's going to come along and tell me that I need new enclosures, who hasn't spent anything like what I have or have the experience. Yes. Like how dare they?
That's such a good point.
But how dare me? You know, how dare I for thinking like, I mean, it's like, but you almost
can see
like,
where there's an antagonizing behavior there. It's like, I don't want to listen to you because you're telling me something that I don't want to know. And you also have no stake in it because you haven't spent any money, and I've spent thousands on these enclosures. So you have to go home.
Exactly. It's cognitive dissonance at its finest.
Yeah.
It's just like, this is my way of thinking. You're telling me facts that are saying that my way of thinking is wrong or needs to be corrected. I don't like that. Go away. You know, and we are all guilty of this at some point or another. It's just human. It's human nature. But man, we got to start listening. We have to start collaborating, and that's not easy to do, especially if this is your business. Mm-hmm. Like I can understand from a business perspective that you've already spent thousands and thousands of dollars on all these enclosures, but now you have to spend more without getting any new animals. Or you have to get rid of animals because you're increasing enclosure size.
It's hard.
When the bottom line is the dollar, you know, like what is it going to come down to in a business aspect? Most people aren't going to go out of their way and do that and provide that, you know, extra space and enrichment and everything.
So as far as for yourself, you're going to work on building a 16-foot? Is that what your plan is, or what's your plan there?
I have plans. Like I said, I'm rehoming a lot of animals in a moment. And I'm going to be selling a lot of I have a lot of vision enclosures. I get a little crazy. I like things to look the same.
Yeah.
But I'll be selling most of my vision enclosures, and I have a good friend, Chris Foley, and he builds enclosures, and we're always chit chatting. I'm always bothering him like, hey man, when are you coming over to build these 16-foot enclosures? at a PVC. Yeah, I'm just ready to drop like $4,000 in Enclosure. Let's do it, baby. But I want to build back my collection. Damn word again. I want to build back my enclosures in a way that I can really, truly be proud of. And I know that I'm doing right by the animals. That's the bottom line.
Yeah. I love that. It's just sort of a reset. It's just, it's going to take time. It's going to take money. Everybody's going to have to be patient with it, but the mistakes that were made, and you can see where you want to go. And it's time to just slowly chip away at that.
Exactly. And I can't ever hate on anybody who's slowly making those changes. A long time ago, I made a post about Savannah monitors, and I'm sure there's a lot of people very opinionated about Savannah monitors, especially in captivity. And all the latest stuff that we know about them, it's like, unless you're providing a minimum of like 18 to 24 inches of substrate just to burrow in, and then branches and stuff to climb on, it's just like nobody wants to do that. I got a Savannah monitor from a friend who was getting rid of his reptiles, and so I told him I'd take it in, and I got like an 8 foot by 3 foot trough, and I built it into an enclosure. And I'm not lying when I say, went to Lowe's and I bought 2,000 pounds of soil and sand to make the substrate, and I filled up this enclosure, and I would I mist it down and everything. And, he have his water dishes and the basking spot. And I'm not going to get too into that, but like this monitor lizard that I've kept a couple over, the last 20 years of my life, is burrowing and creating burrows. And sometimes I go down there and I freak out because I'm like, where is he? Where's this, Savannah, 2.5 foot, 3 foot Savannah monitor lizard? Where'd it go? Oh, there's a giant hole, and you shine a light down, you see his head just another 2 feet down into the hole. And it's like, this is amazing. Yeah. Because I've never seen in captivity an animal being able to burrow like this. And of course I've never seen it because I've never given it to them. And probably, again, random numbers, 90% of Savannah monitor keepers have never done this either.
Yeah.
And so they might read, oh yeah, they'll use burrows, or they might not necessarily burrow, but they'll eat, a rat and then use their own burrow, whatever. But they're not seeing it. And he was burrowing all the time. And every now and again, a burrow would collapse and then he'd make a new one.
Yeah, exactly like they do in the wild.
It was so phenomenal to see. I was so proud to not see this lizard.
Yeah, you're like, yes, he dug another tunnel.
I know. It was fantastic. It's
so then, I don't know. After enclosure size, what do you have? Do you have another bullet point there on your notes? I know we were.
Oh, good. Oh, absolutely. Sorry.
Oh yeah, no worries.
So I think probably something that's really, really pervasive in the hobby today are bad influencers.
Yes.
Again, I'm not going to go out of my way and name names to create more traffic for them, because I'm sure they get enough anyway. But certain people with 1 million reticulated pythons that happen to live in California.
Yeah. And honestly, some of those, I was trying to find a picture of a few of those specific reticulated pythons, because I've seen a few of his pythons, and those ones legitimately look insanely obese. I'm huge. Note the tail is just a 90-degree taper. It's just massive to the cloaca, and then just a tiny little tail that sticks at the bottom. And just wow, I can't imagine what they look like on the inside.
I can't imagine what that snake feels like on the inside.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? To live as that snake. Listen, I'm an overweight guy. And I know what it's like to bend over and tie my shoes, oh shit, my gut gets in the way.
Yeah.
But I can control my own diet. I can lose the weight if I really need to. You know what I mean? I probably should, but I can do that. I'm in control of my own destiny when it comes to that. Animals, snakes cannot do that. We are the ones feeding them. We are the ones controlling their diet, their input, their exercise. It's completely on us. We have to be the stewards for these animals, and to make sure that they're having a proper diet and everything. And then you see these giant influencers that are just, or maybe not even a YouTube influencer, but somebody who is on a big snake forum on Facebook or something. And you see these guys, these big breeders, and they just have these just massively overweight animals, and they're breeding like, females are breeding within 3 years. Males are getting thrown in as low as 12 months.
Yeah.
And they're fed enough to get them to a size where the female won't crush them.
Right.
And it's absolutely, it's kind of insane when you think about it, because it's about that. It's the morph.
It's so weird.
Chasing the dragon for new morphs and whatnot.
Like you're sacrificing the parents because you're going to kill them through obesity just to make new babies, just to do the same thing to those babies, to grow the babies up and then breed them again. So it's like a vicious cycle of emptiness. Yeah.
And think about this. So think about all the fat that builds up inside those animals. Now think about them developing follicles, developing into eggs, and now they're losing that much more space, like that much more constriction on their own organs. Like, yikes.
Not good. Yeah.
Major yikes.
Yeah. So I agree. The influencers are an issue, and just, sort of romanticizing, even romanticizing reticulated pythons. They are not an animal that everybody should own. It's just that's just a fact. It's just not something that should be that popular, I don't think. And to have that being a popular channel and then showing overweight animals on top of it and just glorifying massively thick, huge animals, it's just doesn't paint a good image.
I 100% agree, and that's a great segue into the next point, is that there's too many babies.
Yeah, exactly.
We are producing way too many Burmese pythons, way too many reticulated pythons. And where do they go? Because I'll tell you what, I see 1 million photos a day of all of these, hatchling and juvenile and sometimes subadult reticulated pythons or Burmese pythons. But I don't see tons of photos of like these big, healthy adults, or just adults in general.
Yeah.
Except it's like the same 10 people that you're seeing adults with, and that's a problem. And that it kind of goes back into enclosure size. I had a moment about 5 months ago on a reptile group, which will go unnamed, where people who have probably, 2 to 5 years experience with, let's say, reticulated pythons, saying that it's cool to keep a 10-foot retic up to like 12 foot in a 4-foot by 2-foot vision cage.
Wow.
And so like, these are the recommendations that you're getting. And this is becoming like this weird standard. Now, can I go out there and say, yeah, everybody's doing this? I can't, because I really don't know. But I think it's become so normalized that it's just so many people are doing it, and they think it's okay because everybody else is doing it.
Yeah.
And so how would they know anything else? They're indoctrinated into this weird dogmatic way of thinking.
Yeah.
It's just,
yeah, well, it's a good question. Like, where do the babies go? I think it's simple as that, and I think we know where they go. A lot of them don't make it. A lot of them are overfed and die, and it's. I've said so many times on the podcast, there's always a weird feeling that I get when I walk into a reptile expo and I see a table of retic babies, and I think everybody in this show right now is mostly random public. You could have a couple impulse buyers in here. You're gonna have your classic herpetoculture people, but who's gonna go home with those snakes? You have no clue. It could be anybody is going to go home with a 2-foot long baby reticulated python, and that like a mainland reticulated python going home with somebody. It just makes no sense.
Yep. And it's crazy, because then it becomes a moral dilemma of how do you morally produce this many babies? And we're talking about an animal that on average is going to probably lay between 30 and 60 eggs in a clutch.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's just, for me, like, and listen, I'll be honest with you. I have, I've bred retics. I've bred green anacondas before. Green anacondas are a little different because they're not overproduced, but still, giant snake, commands respect. You can't just sell it to anybody. I feel like it's got to be tough, and to like kind of silence that inner conscience. I don't know. I think about it all the time, and I know I have good friends that that are big snake breeders, multiple friends, and it's just like they probably listen to this and be like, "This guy, fuck Dan," But
throwing us under the bus.
I know, and I don't want to seem like I'm throwing them under the bus, but
I think it's a conversation that needs to be had, and it's
a tough conversation.
Exactly, yeah, and maybe less animals being produced means the babies can go for a higher profit, and the breeders can make the same amount of money with less work. I don't know what the answer is, but we can't continue to have clutches of 35 retic babies just going out as like just a cycle over and over again. It just, because who should keep a big snake? Like, that's a question, I guess. Who do you think, like, what type of person should have that? Someone that has a huge amount of space, like, that's check one.
Yeah, I mean, space, money, but then, have you ever seen the poop that a big snake takes?
They're bigger than my snakes.
I know. So, like, somebody who's got to be willing, like, I'll tell you what, when you feed them and before the poop comes and they just unleash a bunch of water.
Yes.
A big snake's dumping like half a gallon of juice, man. Oh, and God. Like you're getting in that enclosure, you're on your elbows. Like, I got this big beard, so I'll either like braid it and tuck it into my shirt, or if I'm in a rush, it's just like, whatever, man, you're just gonna take a shower afterwards. It's just dragging through it. You have to be willing to work with that animal. And I'm gonna be real. Anybody can take care of a 5-foot reticulated python, a 5-foot Burm, or a green anaconda. Anybody can take care of a 2-foot alligator. Yeah. It's not that challenging. But what do you do when that animal becomes large? What do you do when that animal, there are people who just keep corn snakes and they're like, you know what? I want a python. Let me get a reticulated python because they're super pretty. And I agree that they are super pretty, but you're going from corns or royal pythons or even boa constrictors to reticulated pythons, man. And it's just like an 8-footer left me with a permanent scar on my knuckle. And sometimes if I can touch it a certain way, I can get the nerve to fire off. And just be like, whoa, that little like electric shock feeling.
Yeah.
And that's an 8-footer. So what happens when you have a feeding mishap or the snake's just in a bad mood, and because you're not used to reading reticulated pythons and their behaviors, you take a bite, and an 8-foot reticulated python's not a big snake. Not a big reticulated python, I should say, excuse me. And then you're afraid of it, which means it's probably going to get handled less, which means it'll slowly start becoming more and more feral over time, because when are you pulling it out? You're pulling it out to clean its enclosure, and that's it. So it's not getting any positive interaction times. And because the snake is already now becoming a quote unquote mean snake, you're afraid to handle it. So you're going into it with hooks. You got to like tap the hell out of the snake's head to get it to like turn down like feeding response or defensive. And then you're trying to pull it out, and then the snake's running. And so it's so hard to build a trusting relationship with that animal, because the animal is so defensive and so afraid of you because it hasn't been handled. It's not used to this. And it just becomes a bad experience. And again, when they get larger, it becomes a dangerous experience.
Yes. Well, and I think that it's such a great point that you made. Like, anybody can care for a baby version of any of these. Like, anybody can care for a small Nile crocodile. Like, it's so true. It's exactly. You just don't, and that is the deceiving part, because there's a relatively slow growth. And you're like, okay, he's small right now. It's not going to be 4 or 5 years until it's maybe slightly unmanageable. It's not going to be 10 years until this animal's dangerous, and that's the problem. It's if nobody would buy a full grown reticulated python at a expo as a impulse purchase, but you'll buy a baby as an impulse purchase, which is the same thing. It's just a different amount of time, and so that is a problem. So it's almost like, what do we do? The cat is out of the bag. I would never say like nobody should own these big snakes, but how do we? Maybe is it just better people showing the actual requirements to care for these things?
I think that's a giant step in the right direction. Mm-hmm. I think it's got to hit on all fronts. Ownership, for sure. For new owners, I always say, if it's ever possible, to get experience handling a larger animal like that before you ever buy one. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes, let me tell you, having kept big snakes for close to like 15 years, there are times when you got to go and clean enclosures and you're just tired and you don't want to pull an 80-pound snake that feels like 150 pounds because they fight against you, it is all muscle. And it just sucks sometimes. It legitimately just sucks. There's nothing fun about it. But you got to do it, and you have to clean the enclosure. You're going to have those times. And honestly, people who don't want to put that kind of work in or deal with an animal of that weight and strength, like, it's not for you. Yeah. I think there's a cool factor. There's a wow factor. like, ooh, I can impress so many people with this giant snake. It's an ego boost, it's very masculine, tough guy, macho. Look at me and my giant snake. You know what I mean? It's like the pit bull of the snake world anymore.
Yes. Yeah.
And we have to change that perception into something that's a little more respectable for the animal. We have to have more morally responsible breeding. Like, I don't think people should stop breeding reticulated pythons, but they need to stop breeding reticulated pythons at the rate they're going. Yes. There are some people producing hundreds of baby reticulated pythons. And let me tell you, most of those are cobra food. They're getting fed to king cobras because nobody wants to buy that $75 regular old mainland retic with unknown genetics. Everything's a mutt nowadays in this country. Nobody wants to buy it, so it's going to become cobra food, which in a sense isn't fair to the animal being produced. Didn't ask to be here, and it certainly didn't ask to be thrown into a freezer or thrown into a cobra enclosure alive. So we need less breeding. We need more responsible, like morally, like ethical salesmanship. So I don't even know if that's a very good word. Yeah, that works for now. And I get it. Like, that's a lot of work. That's a ton. It's already a ton of work selling animals, any kind of animal, reptile or not. It's a ton of work. And dealing with people is really tiresome.
Horrible. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so bad. It's so bad. So like, you don't want to do that. And then now I'm telling you, like, well, you should probably spend more time screening people for these animals. Like, is this like an 18-year-old kid still living with their parents? Is this a 20-year-old that's going to try to sneak the snake into a college dorm? Yeah. Like, do they own their own house? Like, are they renting? Like, these are all really important things. And I know it, to some people that might sound ridiculous, but that would prevent so many people from making so many silly, stupid mistakes. At one point I had, I believe, 8 reticulated pythons. And I can tell you that was way too many. And once I had that realization, I unfortunately had to sell them, and I loved them. They were all sweethearts, but I got rid of a few because I'm just like, dude, all these snakes are like 8 feet long now. Oh, they're 9 feet long now. Yeah. Like, why did I get so many? That was dumb. Yeah. But I was just so enthralled by the idea of just giant snakes. Wow, what an amazing thing. But like, we need better, more responsible and ethical practices in selling and breeding, and then better knowledge going out there for new owners. And like, I don't want to see people telling you can throw a 10-foot retic into a 4-foot enclosure. I mean, can you? Sure. Like, does it have to travel somewhere? Is it temporary for a day or two? Yeah. Absolutely. That's fine. The snake will live. But in the long term, like as a semi-permanent enclosure, man, we got to do better. And people should not be backing this up. And I'm not anywhere near as active on social media anymore as I used to be. So I don't know if there's like even more of this stuff running rampant throughout, the community, but I'm sure it is. Well, I haven't seen anybody like coming out, and I know. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off either.
Oh no, go ahead.
You had, what was his name? Nick Bella, I think his name was.
Yeah, Nick Bella. Yeah,
you had him on about, and that's actually how I found your podcast.
That's right. I'm sure Nick is listening to this right now. He normally listens to the show. So,
hello, awesome, awesome. What up, Nick? So he was talking about green anacondas and just like, man, what a great way to go into keeping a green anaconda, man. Like, if a newbie is doing it right, he's doing it. You know what I'm saying? And I'm just like, man, I need somebody like that to have a YouTube channel and to be posting more. I see he's active in Anaconda archives and stuff. I see him post. But like, I need somebody like him and others like him to get get representation, essentially. But a lot of those guys, they don't want the attention, maybe, or whatever reason, they just don't get out there. And also, I think, and I guess to flip the coin here, I think there's a divide in ideologies in the reptile community between like people who love like bioactive setups and stuff, and then people who just keep things in sterile boxes. And I think the conversation, the dynamic between those two parties is terrible.
Yes, it is.
I think the sterile box keepers or anybody who aren't like the bioactive enrichment, like proper size enclosure people, excuse me, I don't know. They can sometimes come across as holier than thou.
Yeah.
And so that's an issue. That's an issue because while I do believe them to be in the right most of the time in anything, it's how they come across. And
it makes you not want to listen.
Exactly. And if you can't be, I don't want to say respectful, because like I think of people like again, you had her on, Ashley Dazan, I think her last name is pronounced. You know, she has these beautiful setups. I love her garter snakes. You know, she's very good at articulating like, hey, do a bioactive, you know, this and that. Like, yeah, she'll make fun of the sterile box keepers here and there. You know, we all do. I do. And I prescribed to that thinking for so long. And then the sterile box keepers, I'll say we need to listen, not become so defensive, and just listen with the intent to learn. Mm-hmm. It's a different perspective. And you know what? Having a bioactive setup in a 12-foot long enclosure that's like 5 feet deep and 3 feet high, that might be really tough. I think it could be done, but it would be really tough, you know? And so like bioactive might not be the way for you, but it doesn't mean that you can't have substrate. Mm-hmm. and have like, you know, 6 inches of substrate that a snake can kind of like, you know, squiggle down into. There just has to be better conversation across the aisle. And that's what it comes down to. People need to stop being so thin-skinned and, you know, accept criticism. And those who are giving the criticism need to just tone it down a bit sometimes. And I'm not saying that everybody's like that. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying I have definitely seen those conversations.
Oh, yeah.
Get a little
I see
crazy.
I've seen those too. And like I always say, you want to present the information in a way that the person is going to apply it. And if you're just sort of ragging on them for their keeping, then nothing will happen. And so I think for both parties, at the end of the day, the answer is whatever is best for the animal. And we did a whole podcast a whole episode of the podcast talking about how bioactive isn't necessarily the best thing for the animal, because some people think like you throw an isopod in your enclosure and now you have this gold standard care. Well, no, we want to make sure we're including enrichment in some way. And if, like you said, if you have a huge 16-foot enclosure, a bioactive enclosure, that would be kind of a nightmare. That'd be so much work. But it doesn't mean you can't have climbing branches and shelves and, you know, natural substrate, like you said. Like, there's ways to do it. And I think the more people, especially in the big snake community, if we start seeing those type of enclosures, because on the top of my head, I can't think of very many. Like Nick is a good example. There's a few on Facebook that I've seen with huge reticulated python enclosures that are really well done, but there's just not enough of that out there to show new keepers like this is how you can do it. It doesn't have to be bioactive. You don't have to have all these crazy bugs running through the soil, but you want to have height, you want to have climbing opportunities, you want to have soil, and you want to have space.
Exactly. And I think that's honestly, if I had to write up like the commandments of keeping large snakes as far as like bare minimums go, to really kind of take us out of the 80s and 90s and into like, hey, the 2020s, man, like let's get this together, is, you know, having the proper size enclosures, having the height on those enclosures, because everybody's concerned about floor area. They're not concerned about height, because how many enclosures can you stack, man? How many snakes can you keep?
Yeah.
Where was I going with that? Oh, I hate it when I derail.
Oh, your bare minimums. You have the
and having like stuff to climb on and substrate. And I feel like that right there, now we're at our bare minimums, proper sizing. And I guess you could say maybe the bare minimum of enrichment inside the enclosure. That's not going into like getting full spectrum lighting, installing fans. So like there's random breezes, misting down the thing, having multiple basking spots, this and that. Like that's, now you're getting into really advanced stuff. But if we could bring the standard of keeping big snakes up to, what I just mentioned, we would probably see much less people keeping in general, because that's so much more that gets into it, which is a good thing. Mm-hmm. It's not for people who make a living off this, which I'm sorry, dudes. I'm not trying to like kill anybody's business. But like you said, we got to really start thinking about the animal first. And I think if we can take it from there and go from there, everything else will start to fall in place.
I completely agree. I think, that what you just laid out there is a huge improvement from the 8x3 drawer that gets pulled out with the snake curled up for half of it. So that's a massive step. And like you say, the snake breeders, we don't want to step on their business, but at the same time, there's other species. They don't have to stick with those species. There's plenty of species to breed and work with. And there are plenty that are even rare in the hobby that could be worked with. So in that ways, there's some wiggle room there. And if a keeper sees, wow, you have a 16 by 6 by however many feet deep enclosure with all these climbing things, maybe I don't want to walk home with this 2-foot retic today, because that does seem like a huge commitment. And that's what we want to start seeing.
Exactly. And imagine the photos you'd see online, like being like, wow, like, could you imagine like you go into like a retic forum and it's just nothing but like these screenshots of these beautiful, like zoo looking enclosures like that. Animal rights activists and people who try to legislate against reptile ownership, they would have so much less ammunition to use against us as
Completely.
Well.
Yeah.
And that's another thing we have to think about, because like I had mentioned, there new regulations hit in where I live. And I just can't jump through the hoops. I can't just drop thousands of dollars to get another license, because I already have 4 from the state, to do certain things. And like, I don't necessarily disagree with some of the things they want to enact, but like some things are just silly. Absolutely silly.
Yeah. But and like you say, we if we give the ammunition, then the legislation just follows immediately, because it's like,
absolutely.
How come when we Google pictures of reticulated pythons, we see 8-foot drawers? So why would we let you guys keep those snakes?
And that's what you're going to see.
Yeah.
Because that's what's trending. That's what's popular.
Yeah.
Those big guys whom we shall not name. Yes. That's monitor lizards and big snakes in these drawers that are 10 inches deep, like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course we're fighting for our rights to be able to keep these animals. And you in Canada, you guys are way more strict with the regulations.
I know. It's funny because, I'm obviously with the herpetoculture world that I'm immersed in. It's mostly American, because YouTube is mainly American. My audience is mostly American. And I hear you guys struggling with things. And then I think you guys have no idea what it's like here. It's totally different. Like, you guys have a constitution that you can stand on, a lot of different things, and it's a lot harder to pull rules away or add rules. Here it's just like, hey, this is the new rule today. And it's not quite like that, but there are many different regulations, and that a lot of them don't even make sense. Like, they're just randomly written and things. So, and like you said, we don't want to lose the privilege to keep them, but we also want to show that we're capable of keeping them ethically and that the animal is healthy and thriving. Simple as that.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more with you.
Well, and I think what's great about this conversation is you are somebody who was in that world. Like, you're not pointing fingers and saying, hey, you guys need to do better. You're saying, hey, I was part of that. I kept in tubs. I kept enclosures too small. I overfed. I made the mistakes. That's totally fine. But I'm here to say we should start trying to step forward.
Yeah. You have to be able to grow as a person, as a human. I think the future of this hobby depends on it, to
Absolutely.
be completely honest with you. And we need to stop overbreeding animals. And I'm not even just talking about like reticulated pythons. That's the new royal python as far as I'm concerned. I saw it start happening about 10 years ago with retics. I'm like, oh my goodness, please don't turn into royal pythons. And it turned into the whole royal python market. And again, inherently, that's not a bad thing, because I love that people can get caught up in the same or similar passion that I'm into. Mm-hmm. I think that's great, and I think it's a very, very rewarding thing, a hobby to have. But at the same time, we can't be overproducing these animals. And you had mentioned like rare species too. Like, everybody gets so caught up in corn snakes and boas, royal pythons, and reticulated pythons. Like, no other snakes exist. And
exactly.
Like I have an Angolan python. I had two. My female, unfortunately, did not make it, which makes me very sad because I've been wanting to work with them for about 10 years. And I finally bit the bullet and dropped the coin because they're not the cheapest snakes on the planet.
No, they're not.
And I got them, and I got a pair, and they're beautiful. And luckily I can say this was completely out of my hands. Sorry, weird tangent, but I got a dishwasher and a new stove installed in my house. And because the one thing was hardwired into the house, they turned off breakers, didn't realize it turned off all the heat in my reptile room.
Oh.
And it was winter.
Oh,
and
no.
My female Angolan came down with a respiratory infection. She went to the vet. She was actually 2 weeks into injections, and then I found her dead. I had her for maybe 6 months. I was heartbroken. But at the same time, I gotta say, going back into the topic we were just discussing, I have her frozen in the freezer, and I'm actually going to be opening her up probably in the next month or two. I have a sneaking suspicion that little Miss Angolan was also obese. And I think that might have contributed to her not being able to kick the respiratory infection.
Well, I would definitely think that's a very likely hypothesis. And I think this is something I was going to say. I would, people are not going to be as comfortable with this as someone like yourself is, who's used to skinning things and whatnot. But I would like to see more people getting necropsies, whether that's through the vet or if you're comfortable doing it on your own, because I would really like to see how many of our animals are dying due to weight-related issues or heart attacks or immune systems being compromised due to having high levels of body fat. And if we started doing that and collecting that data as a whole, we might be a little bit shocked at what we find.
I think, we would definitely be shocked. And it doesn't help that we glorify fat animals.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Chong culture or whatever,
Yeah.
Like I can understand how it's funny or cute or whatever, but at the same time, it's like, oh man, look at this bearded dragon that's so bloated and into like second stage organ failure because it's just so overweight and it can't do anything.
Yeah.
It's like, man, what are we doing? But and then in the case of like some other people's animals that may not look like they're like, oh, it doesn't look like that bearded dragon, so my bearded dragon's not overweight. And the whole time it's like, well, it was. Yeah. It also was. It comes in different forms. So just like some humans wear it better, some animals can wear it better.
Yeah, exactly.
And that makes it even more ambiguous and more tough to call out because not everything is a telltale sign of obesity. Like what I talked about with Samantha. She wasn't a giant flat tire. She didn't have all these rolls. She had other little things here and there, but like she didn't look like all these other snakes.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the red flag for us to kind of pay attention to. So I think it's a good siren you're sounding off. And I think the conversation about the bigger snakes is something that needs to be had. And I think, is there anything else on your list or did we hit everything there?
I'm pretty sure we hit everything. Yeah, I love that. New keepers getting even worse info. Yeah. We got everything.
Yeah. So no, I think, and like I said, you kind of coming at it from that world makes it a little more credible and gives it, a little more honesty. And the fact that you're here talking on the podcast and made that post on Facebook shows that you are actually about the animal. Like you realize we're hurting the animals and we do love the animals and we want to keep them and we enjoy working with them and interacting with them. So if all of that is true, then we must change our ways to make sure they can at least live a healthy and thriving life.
100%. I could never disagree with that. and as somebody who did lectures for 12 years now, I'm kind of like retiring out of it, but you never know. I'd probably pick it back up because I already miss it. But how can I go around teaching children and adults alike about reptiles? And then when I get questions afterward, how can I go around and teach and then turn around and go home and just be like, well, this 6x3 vision's fine for the 15-foot retic, whatever. Yeah. It's fine. It's eating. It breeds.
Yeah.
We know things will breed if they're not thriving. We know. And there's a big difference between surviving and thriving.
Exactly.
So we can do it. I'd love to see the gears start turning. And it's a hard conversation to have because you have to look in. you have to look inwards and you have to be real with yourself.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
a lot of people are afraid of that. And I don't blame them because it doesn't feel good. It feels like shit, man. But once you accept it, it's like, ooh, there we are.
Exactly. And you've gone through it, you've accepted it. And it's hard to make those changes. And like you said, it's a human being thing. We don't like changing what we're doing. So I honestly, this is, I think, a great conversation that we've had. Is there anything else that you wanted to say before we wrapped up? We've really covered a lot. I can't believe it's already 5:46 or 6:46.
Oh, wow, really?
It's just like we flew by through here.
Oh, wow. Yeah. It's so easy. I get talking. I don't shut up, but it's so nice to hear your voice. So nice and sultry. Like I was saying earlier. But if anything, I could say is anybody who's ever considering like a new animal to get, there's nothing wrong with going with a more mainstream animal, but I would say get a book and read or spend a lot of time online. There's so many different species of reptiles, especially in the US, but I guess all over the world, that are being captive bred, ethically, and that are so cool. And we're just, they're overshadowed because, like, look at this crazy, septuplet morph royal python, or this 20-foot retic. Like, they kind of take the spotlight, but like for me, like, I love Angolan pythons. I think they're so awesome. To the texture on them, because they have slightly beaded scales or little circular scales. They're such a cool snake. And if you're into royal pythons, there's no reason why you shouldn't love Angolans. They're a close cousin. They look similar. They're a little on the leaner side, but they, 6 foot, 5-6 foot average. It's a perfect snake. It doesn't get huge. I think people need to really look into more options, because I think there are things out there that a regular Joe Schmo is going to love way more than a Burmese python. Yeah, the Burmese python gets you whatever cred it gets you. You're the most masculine guy in a trailer park. Good for you.
Yeah.
But there's so many other cooler snakes. And I guess one thing I can say for myself is that I limited myself in getting to experience so many things, because doing the lectures, like, I typically stick to the more like show-stopping animals, if you will. And while I love big snakes, and I'll always love big snakes, they have a huge place in my heart. I'm ready to get into Angolan pythons, baby. Like, I love them. They're so silly and stupid, and they're so like, my male, his name's Turd Burglar, and like, a name has never suited him more. He just, I don't know. He's so doofy and stupid and just not very good at climbing and staying on your shoulders, but I love him. He's such a great snake. He's a beautiful snake. And he's great for, like, interactions around kids and other people, to get them interested in animals. I'm just saying, there's probably a snake or a reptile species out there that's better suited for you than a Burmese python or an anaconda or a retic. And you'd be surprised. Like, I always talk about garter snakes because I think they're highly underrated. And because, like, if you're living here in the States or even in Canada, because you guys got them up in Canada, you get the classic, like, breeding balls, the crazy ones.
Oh yeah.
Like, so underrated. And if you can legally keep them, do it. Garter snakes are awesome. They're intelligent. They don't get huge, so you don't need a giant 8-foot enclosure for them, but they're a lot of fun. And I think they would be really rewarding to keep. I kept them, so maybe that's why I love them so much, because, the first snake ever. But I don't know. I think people need to branch out and not be afraid to go into things that are a little more
less popular.
Yeah, less popular, less mainstream, like, and I think when you're learning too, like, you're on that wave of like, oh, we're learning, like, there's not a ton of people breeding them. Because if that's something that really interests you, which, get an animal to get the animal. Don't get the animal, be like, I'm going to breed this, because you don't need to breed everything you own.
Yeah.
But I don't know. It'd be so cool to be on, like, that forefront of just new information coming out. Like, oh, we've been keeping them in this basking range, in this ambient temperature range, but we notice this behavior when we bump the humidity up and keep it ambiently like 20% higher.
Yeah.
And I that must be such an awesome feeling. Like, I'd love to be a part of that,
Absolutely. I think that is really well said. I couldn't agree more. I think there's so many more potential, like the classics, the corns, balls, those are all great animals, but there's so much more out there. And Dan, I really appreciate this conversation. I think, for one, I think I can speak for everybody. Your honesty and vulnerability and sharing the story, I think, is so important. These are the stories that we need to realize it's time to make some changes, and there's some addressing that needs to happen. So this was great. Can you let everybody know where they can find you on Instagram if they want to give you a follow?
Oh, sure. You'll love the name. It's master_gator on Instagram. Feel free to follow me. I post a lot of, recently a lot of flower pictures. I do post a lot of reptile stuff, but I'm a naturalist at heart. So anything growing here in the Northeast, flora and fauna, I'm all about. So
awesome.
Everybody feel free to give me a follow.
Everybody listening is nature lovers, so they'll definitely enjoy the follow. So thank you so much. This was an absolute pleasure, and thank you again for sharing the story.
Awesome. It's a pleasure to be here, man. Thank you.
So as promised, I wanted to leave you guys with a few tips or a list of a couple of things that you can implement at home right now to hopefully ensure that your animals are staying healthy and lean. I think this is one of these topics that is quite scary to listen to. You hear a story like Dan's and you think, oh my gosh, am I doing that to my snake? How much should I feed? What should I be feeding? And there's so many questions that come up, and because of the nature of reptiles, they can be very difficult to judge their obesity. Even I've talked to vets, and even then, scanning them, doing x-rays and whatnot, it still can be a challenge. Especially if they're not that overweight, then you really can't tell. So anyway, I want to give us a few list of things, or a short list of things that we can do to hopefully mitigate some of this and give you guys something. Because like I said, I cannot recommend how to feed your snake. I don't know what you keep. I don't know any questions. There's way too many variables to go down that path. So here's a couple of things that we can do. The first thing would be prey variety. Now, I think this is something that we've talked about before on the podcast. That's just part of enrichment, having different variety of prey items for your animals. Now, I keep mentioning snakes, but really this has to do with reptiles in general. So if I do say snakes, it's because my snakes are my brain, but reptiles in general, this works for. So prey variety, super important. Now, getting back to snakes, we feed rats, lab rat, over and over again. And that's really what a lot of people consider to be a complete whole meal staple. And yes, the snakes can survive off that. But there's a couple things to think about. The first is, even if in the wild, the species of snake that you have eat a lot of mammals, the mammals they eat in the wild are most likely going to be a lot leaner. If you're a hunter, or if you've done any deer hunting or anything, you know that wild game is always leaner than we have our factory farm cows. The same thing's going to be true with our factory farmed rodents. They're going to have a higher fat content just by virtue of how they were cared for. So even if you do have a species that is a heavily mammal-eating species in the wild, it's going to be getting less fat tissue from its prey just by virtue of the eating wild prey. Now, the second thing that is now bringing into the variety into the picture is a lot of snakes are generalists. They're going to kind of take whatever comes by their path. Not always, but in a lot of cases. So a lot of snakes eat reptiles. A lot of snakes eat birds, and some snakes even eat fish as well. Birds and reptiles are very lean compared to mammals, as a blanket statement. So if you have, for example, boas in the wild, they're going to eat, I think it's like 40% reptiles and maybe another 30 or 40% birds, and then 20 to 30% mammals, whatever the math is there. So if I'm constantly feeding mammals, I'm really adding way more fat tissue to their diet, or fat to their diet, than they would have in the wild. So I mix in a lot of quail, or even if you can even change what type of rodents you're doing if you want to have some variety that way. But quail or chickens or chicks, depending on the size of your bird or size of your snake, will mix up that prey item and give them a leaner option. And I think it's just also healthy. One of the markers of a healthy person is how diverse their gut biome is, the bacteria that lives in their intestines. Now, I don't know if this is true for reptiles, but I can assume that the more diversity they have in their gut biome, the healthier they're going to be as well. And the way you get a diverse gut biome is by having a varied diet. So varied diet is my first point, mixing in some reptile prey items or some bird prey items to make sure we're not constantly hitting them with that lab rat. Now, the second and probably most important and most obvious point is exercise or calorie expenditure. In the wild, we don't really know how often snakes eat in the wild. There are some studies that follow specimens around to see how often they eat, but really it can be hard to tell, hard to find the same specimen. So who knows how many meals they're taking a year, and it could be different depending on where they live. If there's lots of small prey items where they live, they could be taking lots of small prey items, but maybe the same species in a slightly different area take only a few bigger prey items. So who knows? But the one thing that we know for sure is consistent across the board for wild animals is they burn way more calories than the animals in captivity do. There's just no question, either hunting or migrating or searching for mates or whatever it is, there's going to be a much higher caloric expenditure, which means we need to be providing an opportunity for our animals to burn calories in captivity. So how do you do that? First thing, provide space. The enclosure needs to be large enough for the snake to get exercise. Some people say, well, I take my snakes out and give them exercise that way, and that's great. That's awesome, but you still want to provide enrichment within the enclosure. I mean, the point that Dan made in the podcast is like, how, if you have 20, 30 snakes, are you really taking them out on a day-to-day basis and exercising them all? Probably not. So again, that's a good practice to do, but you still want to make sure that in the enclosure, they have opportunity to work out and to exercise. So this is where adding natural features into the enclosure is so important. If your animal is an arboreal species, it needs to have space to climb. You just need to have climbing opportunities. Squeezing branches and wrapping their tail around or gripping there with their, I want to say hands, but their feet, that is all going to create muscle tone and going to burn calories, and it needs to happen. If they are a digging species or a species that like to burrow and dig, give them that opportunity. That's going to burn a tremendous amount of calories. Swimming is another one. If they like to be in the water, use your imagination, use the natural history of your animal to understand what the enclosure needs to be to make sure they can start burning calories while they're in their enclosure. Another really interesting way to induce some behavior is by making small changes in the enclosure. Maybe add some different scents or change the decor just a little bit. You don't want to change it a ton, but change it a little bit. That will induce foraging behavior for most reptiles. They'll come, they'll explore it. Maybe it'll take them a couple hours to get over there and finally have, be courageous enough to go check out the new thing. All of that is going to cause movement and burn calories, which is exactly what we want. Another interesting thing about burning calories is just, I was thinking about this today, is the metabolic rate, or in reptiles we call it the standard metabolic rate, which is the amount of gas it takes for them to just idle at rest. How much calories are they burning just resting? Now, one way the metabolic rate will increase is through a temperature increase. As the reptile's body increases in temperature, their metabolic rate is going to increase. Now, this is a speculation. I'm just going to say it, so take it with a grain of salt. I can only assume that if you're using an efficient heat source like a halogen bulb that's going to have near infrared wavelengths, since that is more efficient and it's warming them up more thoroughly, I can assume that that's going to increase their metabolic rate or their standard metabolic rate higher than something as a simple heat mat. So it could be that even having a good light bulb and a good heat source, natural heat source like a halogen or a tungsten filament lamp, might increase just their standard metabolic rate, which means they're going to be burning more calories just basking under the bulb. So that might be something to consider as well. Now, to loop into this exercise group, which sort of relates to it, is we want to reduce chronic stress. Now, I kind of keep this as part of the same point because the solution is the same. So how do you reduce chronic stress in the animals? Well, again, make sure you're providing an opportunity for them to behave naturally. So if they climb, they got to have space to climb. If they dig, they got to have space to dig. If an animal is kept in an environment where it cannot act naturally, it's going to become chronically stressed. That's just what happens over time. Those stress hormones bump up and it will be constantly sitting with a high stress hormone level, which is bad. And I'll talk about that in a second. And the other way people can induce chronic stress is by completely cleaning their enclosures on a regular basis. It's been shown that snakes produce pheromones and they'll mark out their territory and mark out their space. And if you come into their enclosure and clean out everything, top to bottom, sterilize it all, you're wiping all of that out. So when you place them back in that enclosure, you're going to induce a stress response. Stress is not always a bad thing, but chronic stress is a bad thing. So if you're cleaning every week and doing that, you're going to create chronic stress. So I'm not saying don't clean your cages, but I'm saying if you have a nice big 6-foot cage and there's waste in one corner, clean the one corner, sterilize the one corner, do a good job cleaning, but you don't have to clean everything. So keep that in mind. Now, why do we want to decrease chronic stress? There's a few things that happen with chronic stress. And, it's actually kind of tough to find some of this information on reptiles. We know what happens in mammals. It might not be exactly the same in reptiles, but there's a few things that we know for sure that happen in reptiles. It can induce inactivity. So not always, but sometimes it will cause the animals to just be completely stationary and not move, which means they're not going to thermoregulate. They're not going to do But the most important thing is they're not going to be burning calories moving, which is a very bad thing. High levels of the stress hormone corticosterone starts to break down muscle tissue. The same thing happens in humans when we have high levels of cortisol. Our muscle tissue will start to break down because your body's going into fight or flight and it wants energy, so it's going to put the glucose from that muscle tissues or from the proteins from our muscle tissues into our blood, and you're putting yourself in that fight or flight response, and your body's just kind of constantly making fuel from what it has. And so muscle breaking down is one of the things that happens. Now, why that is bad is because that actually reduces the reptile's standard metabolic rate. So like I was talking about before, how much gas does it take for that animal just to idle in, when it's just resting? If you decrease the muscle tissue that animal has, the amount of gas that it takes just to idle that animal is going to be less. So if you continue feeding it the same amount and it continues to have a lack of movement and lack of exercise, you're now going to be having, a caloric surplus, which will lead to extra body fat storage. Now, as we're talking about chronic stress, one thing that's interesting to throw in is we know that when animals are chronically stressed for long periods of time, it down-regulates their immune system for a whole bunch of reasons. I mean, in humans as well. Humans and animals who are under lots of chronic stress can get sick a lot easier. So that's something else to keep in mind. That's another reason why we want to decrease chronic stress as much as possible. Now, to bring this quickly back to the obesity topic, something that's really interesting that Francis Koskiri was telling me a couple of days ago, and I think it was a great point. See, he said, as a reminder, vitamin D is fat soluble. So if you are just say you have an animal that's ingesting lots of vitamin D through its diet, through its prey items and whatnot, if you have a high level of adipose tissue or fat tissue in the body, those fat storage can actually sequester the vitamin D and actually absorb it away from the body. So you could have an animal that's ingesting adequate levels of vitamin D3, but when you test it, it will actually seem low. And the reason it's low is because you have a high level of body fat that's absorbing the vitamin D. And we know vitamin D is integral to immune system. So again, that sort of links it back to the immune system. So lots of stress can down-regulate the immune system. Lots of fat tissue can also down-regulate vitamin D. And then it's sort of a recipe for disaster. And the third point I want to make is don't be afraid to skip a meal here or there. Like I said, it's very tough for us to actually replicate the amount of caloric expenditure these animals have in the wild. So if you feed every 2 weeks, skip a meal once in a while. If you feed every 3, skip a meal once in a while. Just have 1 or 2 times where you're actually giving them a little bit of a fast, a little bit of a break. There's some really good repair that can happen during a fasted state for both snakes and humans, and that is when they'll start tapping into those fat storages when they're in that fasted state, but they won't tap into those fat stores unless they get into a fasted state. So I can't recommend how long to fast your snake for because who knows what you're keeping, I don't know how old it is, whatever, but give it a little bit of a stretch. That will help them start to utilize those fat tissues and allow us to not overbuild up fat storage. And so one thing I always say when I'm talking about fasting your snakes, get your scale out. Make sure you're weighing the animals, monitor them during that time. If you're doing a 4-week or a 6-week fast, weigh them every week. As long as they're not losing crazy amounts of weight, you're okay. These animals are unbelievably efficient at what they're doing, and it does take them a long time to burn through that storage fat. So keep that in mind. And one last thing I'll say when we're talking about meals here, because one of the first things that pops up is meal size. How big should the prey be? So we often always recommend, the prey size should be around the thickest part of the snake. And again, I'm going back to snakes, but if you're a lizard keeper, you can implement this into a different way. But how large should the prey size be? That's always what we typically recommend in captivity just because it's the safest for them to eat. But something interesting to consider is that it actually takes more energy for a snake to digest a large meal than it takes for it to digest a small meal. So let me explain what I mean. If I had 2 snakes and they're both the same size and everything, and I had one eat a 5-pound meal, and then I had the other one eat 5 1-pound meals over an extended period of time, the one that ate the smaller meals, the 5 smaller meals, would have more energy to use from those prey items. Okay, because when they're digesting such a large prey item, a big hunk of biomass, they actually have to burn calories to get that done. So the saying, you have to make money to spend money, or you have to spend money to make money. Let me make sure the saying's right. You have to spend money to make money. In that case, it's the same thing. These snakes are going to have to spend energy to get the energy from that item. And since it's so big, it's actually going to cost them some calories in order to digest that. Now, if you have the 5 smaller meals, it costs them less energy to do so. So the only reason I'm bringing that up is because we do feed those medium to sort of some semi-large or semi-small prey size all the time. So they become very efficient at digesting that. And like I said, if the 5 prey items at 1 pound gave them more energy, they either need to burn that through exercise or they're going to store it as fat. So you need to be very careful. And that's why I recommend, don't be afraid to skip a meal here or there. That's not a big deal. And the last point I want to make, and I think I made it in the podcast, is I think it would be really interesting if you're comfortable with this, if you're comfortable having a vet do this or do it yourself, I would like to see more necropsies, more people doing postmortems on their animals, especially animals that were kept in smaller enclosures that, are claimed to be all they need. I would like to start seeing those animals be opened up. And I know it's kind of gruesome and a little bit morbid to talk about, but I'd like to see what the shape of those animals are. Are most of these animals dying of health or of fat-related issues or obesity-related issues? Because that would be really good information for us to know. So I think this is where herpetoculture can do some citizen science here and take it upon ourselves to figure out what is going on. So I think that's something that I would throw out there if anyone thinks like, hey, maybe next time if I unfortunately have an animal pass away, maybe I'll take it to the vet and have them open it up and just, take a look at what's going on. So just to summarize that, I know I'm rambling a lot, but just to quickly summarize that, prey variety, make sure the animal has access to exercise and burn calories and simultaneously reducing chronic stress. Don't be afraid to skip a meal. Those are the real 3 tips that I think I can somewhat generally say across the board. Again, body condition is if you have your animal on the scale, that way you can kind of maintain to see if they're losing weight or gaining weight. That's one of the easiest ways to do it. But I think those are 3 good general rules. Now, when I'm thinking about this, I think if I wanted to create an environment that had a lack of activity, a lack of natural features for the animal to interact with, an environment that was perpetually being cleaned 100%, animals that were being fed the same prey item on a weekly to biweekly basis, animals that don't have access to light to maybe increase some of that metabolic rate. I mean, I'm just describing a sterile industrial tub setup. After doing some thinking here, I'm thinking if somebody said, Dylan, write down an environment that you could induce obesity the easiest, it would be a sterile environment. I would go, okay, remove all access to exercise, feed fatty prey items and don't change the diet, increase the chronic stress a little bit, and never skip a meal. That is a recipe for obesity. It's just simple as that. You have high levels of stress, no ability to burn those calories off, and lots of meals, lots of fatty prey items. I mean, it wouldn't be a surprise if that number that I've heard, around 90% of snakes in captivity are fat, if that was true. So anyway, hopefully these 3 pointers are something, especially if you're new and you want something to grasp onto, hopefully those 3 pointers help you out. And let's go to the outro. Thanks for listening, guys. All right, thank you so much for listening to the episode. That is the end. I really do appreciate everyone sticking around. Hopefully you found the episode enlightening and helpful. Dan, thank you so much for jumping on an episode and sharing your story. Like I said, I think it took a lot of guts to share that story, and the fact that it's been shared on Facebook over 1,000 times really shows the potency of that story. People are generally worried about this, and it's a conversation that absolutely needs to be had. So good on you for starting that conversation, and hopefully this podcast can continue that going. Listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. As always, I do really appreciate it. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider sharing it on social media. And if you would like to join us on Patreon, head to patreon.com/animalsathome. And thank you very much to customreptilehabitats.com for sponsoring this episode of the podcast. If you are in need of any good, high-quality reptile equipment, head to the show notes or the YouTube description. You will find an affiliate link there. If you do make a purchase, a small commission does come back to me at no extra cost to you, and that helps me keep the lights on in this room. All right, that wraps up this episode, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will catch you next week.